Princess Anne, the royal family's most unshakable pillar of silence and discretion, walked into Buckingham Palace at dawn carrying a burgundy folder that would detonate like a bomb in King Charles's hands. Inside were months of meticulously gathered evidence proving that Queen Camilla had orchestrated a calculated, ruthless campaign to systematically destroy Catherine's reputation, isolate her from all support, and force the future queen consort out of the royal family forever. What Anne revealed in that folder was so devastating, so undeniable, that within hours the king would face an impossible choice: protect his wife of 20 years, or save the mother of his grandchildren and the monarchy itself from complete collapse. The warning signs. The autumn rain fell steadily against the windows of Gatcombe Park as Princess Anne sat in her study, reviewing correspondence that had arrived that morning from Buckingham Palace. The documents before her were routine: schedules, patronage updates, the usual administrative matters that kept the royal machinery running. But tucked between the official papers was something that made her pause: a handwritten note on Clarence House stationery, unsigned but unmistakable in its intent. The message was brief, almost casual, but Anne had spent 7 decades navigating the treacherous waters of palace politics. She knew a declaration of war when she saw one. The note suggested, in carefully chosen words, that perhaps the Princess of Wales might benefit from a more extended period of recovery, that perhaps her return to public duties should be reconsidered, that perhaps a more permanent arrangement might be in everyone's best interests. Anne set the note down slowly, her jaw tightening in that way those close to her had learned to recognize as a sign of barely contained fury. Catherine had been through hell. The cancer diagnosis earlier that year had shocked the nation, but the princess had faced it with the quiet dignity that had become her trademark. She had undergone treatment, maintained her composure through unimaginable stress, and was carefully rebuilding her strength. The public had rallied around her with an outpouring of affection that had surprised even seasoned royal watchers. The Waleses represented something hopeful to people, a modern family navigating real struggles while maintaining their sense of duty. And now this. Anne stood and walked to the window, her reflection ghosting across the rain-streaked glass. She had watched Camilla's ascent with a mixture of pragmatism and wariness. Her brother Charles had loved Camilla for decades, and Anne had eventually made her peace with that reality. She had even come to respect certain aspects of how Camilla had handled her difficult position. But respect was not the same as trust, and Anne had not survived this long in the royal family by ignoring her instincts. Those instincts were screaming now. Anne had noticed the subtle shifts over the past months. The way certain courtiers who owed their positions to Camilla had begun speaking about Catherine's absence with just a touch too much concern, a hint too much speculation about whether she would truly be able to resume her full schedule. The way photographs of Camilla were suddenly appearing more prominently in palace releases. The way stories were being planted in the press about the queen consort stepping up to fill gaps left by Catherine's illness. It was masterful, really. Nothing overt enough to be called out directly, just a steady drip of suggestion, a careful repositioning of pieces on the chessboard. But Anne had seen this game played before. She had watched Diana be frozen out, had seen Sarah Ferguson marginalized, and had observed firsthand how palace machinery could be weaponized against those deemed inconvenient or threatening. She had been largely powerless to stop it then, bound by her own sense of duty and royal protocol. She would not be powerless now. Anne pulled out her phone and sent a brief text to her private secretary. She needed to see Catherine, privately and soon, and she needed to have a very frank conversation with her brother, the king. Because if Camilla thought she could orchestrate the removal of the future queen, the Princess of Wales, the mother of the future king, without Anne standing in her way, then the queen consort was about to learn a very hard lesson about underestimating the only daughter of Queen Elizabeth II. The rain continued to fall as Anne began making her plans. She thought of her mother, of how Elizabeth had navigated decades of palace intrigue with steel beneath silk. Anne had inherited that steel, perhaps more nakedly than her brothers. She had spent her life being dismissed as difficult, too direct, unwilling to play the games that others found so essential. But that very directness, that very unwillingness to engage in subterfuge, had earned her a reputation for integrity that was unmatched in the family. And she was about to use every bit of that reputation, every ounce of her influence, and every lesson she had learned in 7 decades of royal service to protect Catherine. Not just because it was the right thing to do, though it was, but because the future of the monarchy itself hung in the balance. The public loved Catherine in a way they had never quite loved Camilla, no matter how many years passed or how many carefully orchestrated PR campaigns were launched. If Catherine were to be pushed out, if she were to be made to feel unwelcome or unnecessary, the damage to the crown could be catastrophic. Anne sat back down at her desk and began to write. Not on official stationery this time, but on her own personal paper, a letter to Catherine, carefully worded but unmistakable in its message. You are not alone. You are not without allies, and anyone who thinks they can remove you from this family will have to go through me first. The evidence mounts. 3 days later, Princess Anne arrived at Adelaide Cottage in Windsor without fanfare. She had deliberately chosen to drive herself, without police escort or accompanying staff, in her reliable old Land Rover. Some conversations were best conducted without witnesses, and this would be one of them. Catherine opened the door herself, surprise flickering across her features before she smiled warmly and ushered Anne inside. They sat in the comfortable kitchen rather than any formal receiving room. Anne had always appreciated that about Catherine. She understood when to stand in ceremony and when to simply be human. Tea was made, pleasantries were exchanged about the children, and then Anne got to the point with her characteristic directness. I need you to tell me what has been happening, Anne said, setting down her cup. All of it. The things you have not told William, the things you have not told anyone because you do not want to cause trouble or seem paranoid or weak. Catherine looked at her for a long moment. Those green eyes that had charmed a nation now shadowed with something that looked like relief, mixed with apprehension. Then slowly, she began to talk. The story that emerged over the next hour was damning in its accumulation of small cuts, each one seemingly insignificant on its own, but together forming a clear pattern of systematic exclusion. It had started subtly, Catherine explained, even before her diagnosis. Invitations to certain meetings that used to come routinely had begun to dry up. She would hear about decisions that affected her patronages secondhand, through staff rather than directly. Her input on matters related to early childhood development, her signature issue, was being sought less frequently. When she did offer suggestions, they were acknowledged politely but rarely implemented. Then came the diagnosis, and everything accelerated. Catherine understood the need to step back from public duties during treatment. That was not the issue. The issue was that the machinery of the palace had not simply maintained her position during her absence, but had actively begun reassigning her responsibilities as though she were not returning. Patronages she had carefully cultivated were being passed to others. Events she had been scheduled to attend were being given to different members of the family. Her private secretary had been approached about temporarily reducing staff, temporary being a word that Catherine understood could very quickly become permanent. The worst part, Catherine said quietly, is the way certain people speak to me now, as though I am fragile, as though I am no longer quite up to the job. There is this tone, this suggestion that perhaps I have been through too much, that perhaps I should focus on my health and my family and let others handle the more demanding aspects of royal life. Anne felt her anger building, but she kept her expression neutral, encouraging Catherine to continue. The younger woman described meetings where Camilla had been present, meetings that should have been straightforward discussions of scheduling or patronage matters, but that had somehow become platforms for the Queen Consort to hold forth on how she had learned to manage her own workload, how important it was not to overextend oneself, how sometimes stepping back was the most dignified choice. She never says anything directly, Catherine explained. It is all couched in concern, in wanting what is best for me, but the message is clear. I am being given permission to step away, and if I do not take that permission voluntarily, arrangements will be made to ease me out regardless. Anne asked about William, and Catherine's expression grew more troubled. He sees some of it, but not all. He is furious about the parts he knows, but I have tried to shield him from the worst of it. He is caught between his father and his wife, and that is an impossible position. Charles does not see what Camilla is doing, or perhaps he does not want to see it. She is his great love, his second chance at happiness, and he is blind to her flaws in a way that would be touching if it were not so dangerous. The picture that emerged from Catherine's careful words was of a campaign being waged on multiple fronts. Courtiers loyal to Camilla were spreading whispers about Catherine's health, about whether someone with a serious illness could be relied upon for the demanding schedule of a working royal. Stories were being leaked to friendly journalists suggesting that Catherine might welcome a quieter life, that she had never really enjoyed the public spotlight, that motherhood and family were her true priorities. None of it was false exactly, but all of it was designed to create a narrative of a woman gracefully retreating from public life rather than being pushed. Anne listened to it all, her mind cataloging every detail, every name, every incident. When Catherine had finished, Anne reached across the table and took her hand. "You did the right thing to tell me," she said firmly, "and you are not imagining this. What Camilla is doing is calculated, deliberate, and utterly unacceptable." Catherine looked at her with something like hope. "But what can be done? She is the queen consort. Charles adores her. I am still recovering, still finding my strength. If I push back too hard, I look petty or paranoid. If I do nothing, I will wake up one day to find I have been completely sidelined." Anne's smile was not pleasant. What can be done is that Camilla is about to discover that she is not the only person in this family with experience in palace warfare. And unlike her, I do not need to work through proxies and whispers. I will go directly to my brother and lay this out for him. He may be besotted with his wife, but he is also king, and he cannot afford to let his personal feelings destroy the future of the monarchy. Catherine looked worried. That could cause a terrible rift. It could, Anne agreed, but the alternative is worse. The alternative is that you are pushed out, that William is left embittered and resentful, that the next generation's faith in the institution is shattered. Charles may not like what I have to tell him, but he will listen. He has no choice. They talked for another hour, with Anne asking detailed questions and making notes. She wanted dates, specific incidents, names of who had said what and when. Catherine was hesitant at first, uncomfortable with the idea of building what amounted to a dossier against the queen consort. But Anne was insistent. If they were going to confront this head-on, they needed to do so with evidence, not suspicions. As Anne prepared to leave, she turned to Catherine one last time. "You are the future of this family," she said firmly, "not just because of your title, but because you represent what the monarchy needs to be. Modern, compassionate, relatable, but still dignified and devoted to duty. The public loves you in a way they will never love Camilla, no matter how many years pass. That is not an insult to her, simply a fact, and facts matter in this situation." Catherine walked her to the door, and Anne could see some of the weight had lifted from her shoulders. As Anne drove away from Adelaide Cottage, her mind was already racing ahead to the confrontation to come. She would need to be strategic about this, careful in how she presented the information to Charles, but she would also need to be unflinching, willing to risk his anger and Camilla's wrath if it meant protecting Catherine and, by extension, the crown itself. The confrontation. Anne chose Balmoral for the confrontation. It was late October, and Charles was spending a few days at the Scottish estate before returning to London for a packed schedule of autumn engagements. The setting was deliberate. Balmoral had always been a place where the family could speak more freely, away from the eyes and ears of palace staff who might have divided loyalties. It was also their mother's favorite place, and Anne thought Elizabeth's spirit might lend her cause some moral authority. She arrived on a gray afternoon, the heather-covered hills shrouded in mist. Charles greeted her warmly, clearly pleased to see his sister. They had dinner together that evening, just the two of them, with Camilla conveniently away in London for a series of engagements. Anne suspected Charles had arranged it that way, sensing from her tone when she had requested the meeting that this would not be a casual visit. They made small talk through dinner, discussing estate matters and family news, but when they retired to the drawing room afterward, Charles settled into his chair and looked at his sister with a mixture of fondness and wariness. "All right, Anne," he said, "out with it. What is so important that you drove 500 miles to tell me in person?" Anne did not waste time on the preamble. She laid out everything Catherine had told her, backing it up with the dates, the incidents, the patterns she had documented. She explained how systematically Catherine was being marginalized, how the machinery of exclusion was operating under the cover of concern for her health. She detailed the whisper campaign, the reassignment of duties, the tone of condescension that had crept into how certain people addressed the Princess of Wales. Charles listened in silence, his expression growing darker as Anne continued. When she reached the part about courtiers loyal to Camilla being at the center of much of the activity, he held up a hand. "That is quite an accusation," he said coldly. "It is not an accusation, it is a fact," Anne shot back. "And before you dismiss this as sisterly dramatics or Catherine being oversensitive after her illness, I want you to consider something. What benefits from Catherine being sidelined? Who gains from the Princess of Wales being perceived as too fragile or too unreliable to fulfill her duties?" Charles stood and walked to the window, his back to her. When he spoke, his voice was tight. "Camilla has worked incredibly hard to earn her place in this family. She has endured decades of vilification and scorn. She has supported me through everything and asked for nothing in return. Now she is finally receiving some of the recognition she deserves. And you come here suggesting she is engaged in some sort of plot?" "I am not suggesting anything," Anne said, her voice hard. "I am telling you what is happening. Whether Camilla is orchestrating it directly or whether her most devoted supporters are acting to please her is almost beside the point. The effect is the same. Catherine is being pushed out, and if you do not stop it, the consequences will be catastrophic." Charles turned to face her, his expression anguished. "Catherine is still recovering. Surely you can understand why people might be concerned about her taking on too much too soon." "Charles," Anne stood and crossed to him, "do you really believe that is what this is about? Because if you do, you are deluding yourself. This is about power. This is about Camilla's people protecting her position and seeing Catherine as a threat to her prominence. The public adores Catherine. They respect Camilla perhaps after all these years, but they love Catherine. That love threatens certain narratives that have been carefully constructed." She softened her tone slightly. "I know you love Camilla. I know she makes you happy, and God knows you deserve happiness after everything you have been through. But you are king now. You cannot afford to let your personal feelings blind you to what is happening in your own household. This is not about you and Camilla. This is about the future of the monarchy. It is about William and Catherine and George and Charlotte and Louis. They are the future, Charles, not us." Charles sank back into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 76 years. "What do you want me to do?" Anne sat across from him. "I want you to pay attention. I want you to question the advice you are receiving, particularly from those closest to Camilla. I want you to make it absolutely clear to everyone that Catherine is to be supported in her return to full duties, not managed into early retirement. I want you to speak to your wife and make sure she understands that any attempt to marginalize the Princess of Wales will not be tolerated. You're asking me to accuse my wife of something terrible on the basis of what Catherine perceives and what you have interpreted," Charles said quietly. "I am asking you to open your eyes," Anne replied. "Look at the evidence yourself. Ask questions. Watch how people behave when Catherine's name comes up in meetings. See who is quick to suggest she might need more time, more rest, less responsibility. Follow the threads, Charles, and they will all lead back to the same place." They sat in silence for a long moment, the fire crackling in the grate. Finally, Charles spoke. "If I discover you are right, if Camilla has been involved in this, even indirectly, it will destroy everything. Our marriage barely survived the scrutiny before. If this becomes public, if people think she is trying to remove Catherine, then you need to make sure it does not become public," Anne said bluntly. "Handle it privately and decisively. Make the changes needed to protect Catherine. Ensure that Camilla's people understand the boundaries. And if Camilla herself has been party to this, then you need to have a very frank conversation with your wife about the difference between being queen consort and being queen, and about the fact that she will never be the latter regardless of how successfully she might sideline Catherine." Charles flinched at that, but Anne pressed on. "I know that sounds harsh, but it is reality. Camilla's supporters may have convinced themselves that if Catherine were out of the picture, Camilla would somehow become the undisputed First Lady of the realm. But it does not work that way. If Catherine leaves, William's resentment will fester. The public will turn against you both. And when William eventually becomes king, Camilla will find herself frozen out completely. Is that what she wants? Is that the legacy she hopes to leave?" "You do not understand her," Charles said. "She has never sought the spotlight. She would be perfectly happy retiring to the country and never attending another engagement. Then why are her people working so hard to expand her role at Catherine's expense?" Anne asked pointedly. "Charles, I am trying to help you here. I am trying to prevent a disaster that will tear this family apart and damage the crown possibly beyond repair. But I need you to be willing to see what is actually happening rather than what you wish were happening." They talked late into the night, going over details, examining motives, considering options. By the time Anne retired to her room, she was exhausted but cautiously hopeful. Charles was shaken, she could see that. Whether he was shaken enough to take action remained to be seen. She had planted the seeds. Now she had to trust that her brother, despite his blind spots where Camilla was concerned, still had the judgment to recognize a threat to his reign and his family's future. As she lay in bed, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Anne thought about her mother. Elizabeth had been a master of subtle intervention, of guiding without seeming to direct. Anne had none of her mother's subtlety, but she had inherited her mother's fierce protectiveness of the institution. The crown was more important than any individual, more important than personal happiness or private grievances. Elizabeth had understood that, had lived it every day of her reign. Charles needed to remember it now. The reckoning. The days following Anne's visit to Balmoral unfolded with deceptive calm. To the outside world, the royal family continued its usual routines. Engagements were attended, speeches were made, photographs were taken. But beneath the surface, seismic shifts were occurring. Charles had begun asking questions, and the answers he was receiving were clearly unsettling him. Anne knew this because she was receiving almost daily calls from her brother. He had started paying closer attention to how decisions were being made, who was suggesting what regarding Catherine's schedule and duties. He had reviewed correspondence he had previously approved without much scrutiny. He had spoken to William carefully, probing to understand his son's perspective without revealing his own concerns. And he had finally confronted Camilla. That conversation, Anne learned from a terse phone call from Charles, had not gone well. Camilla had been furious at the suggestion she was involved in any campaign against Catherine. She had accused Anne of poisoning Charles against her, of never accepting her, of looking for any excuse to undermine her position. She had pointed out, not incorrectly, that Anne had a history of being protective of the younger generation, that she had clashed with palace officials before over how Diana had been treated, and that her judgment might be clouded by past regrets. But Charles had pressed, and under sustained questioning, things had emerged. Camilla had not ordered anyone to sideline Catherine, but she had expressed concern, repeatedly and to people who were in positions to act on those concerns. She had suggested that perhaps Catherine was too fragile to return to a full schedule. She had wondered aloud whether it might be kinder to reduce expectations, to allow Catherine to focus on recovery without the pressure of royal duties. She had, in her own words, simply been thinking of Catherine's well-being. "She does not see it as pushing Catherine out," Charles had told Anne wearily. She genuinely believed she was being considerate, giving Catherine an exit if she wanted one. And did it never occur to her that those helpful suggestions might be interpreted as orders by people eager to please the Queen Consort? Anne had asked sharply. Did she not realize that expressing doubt about Catherine's ability to continue effectively gives permission to others to act on those doubts? Charles had no good answer to that, because of course Camilla had known, at least on some level. She had been navigating royal politics for too long not to understand how power worked, how a carefully placed word from the right person could set entire chains of action in motion. Whether she had intended the full extent of what had resulted or had simply been careless with her influence was almost immaterial at this point. The damage had been done. The reckoning came at a family meeting at Windsor Castle in early November. Anne had pushed for it, arguing that this needed to be addressed formally with all the principals present. Charles had been reluctant, fearing it would only create more division, but Anne had been insistent. Wounds that were not cleaned out festered, and this wound needed to be lanced before it became fatal. William and Catherine arrived together, their faces carefully neutral. Camilla came with Charles, looking defensive and angry. Anne was already there, having helped arrange the meeting. She had also ensured that no private secretaries or staff would be present. This was a family business, and it would be handled by the family. They gathered in one of the private sitting rooms, the formal portraits of past monarchs looking down on them as if in judgment. Charles opened by acknowledging that there had been concerns raised about how Catherine's return to duties was being managed. He spoke carefully, trying to be diplomatic, but Anne could see William's jaw tightening with each carefully chosen word. Finally, William could no longer contain himself. "Concerns raised?" he said, his voice hard. "My wife is being systematically marginalized, her work is being dismantled, and you describe it as concerns being raised?" "William," Charles began, but his son was not finished. "Do you have any idea what this has been like for her? She has been dealing with cancer, with treatment, with the fear and uncertainty that comes with that diagnosis. And instead of being supported, instead of being told that her place is secure and waiting for her when she is ready, she has been made to feel that she is being replaced, that she is dispensable." Catherine placed a hand on William's arm, but he shook his head. "No, this needs to be said. My mother was driven away by the very same mechanisms that are being used against my wife. The suggestions that she was not quite suitable, the systematic exclusion from the inner circle. I watched it happen, and I was too young and powerless to stop it then. I am not too young anymore, and I will not stand by while history repeats itself." The room went silent. Comparing Catherine's situation to Diana's was perhaps the one thing that could cut through all the careful diplomacy and force everyone to confront what was really at stake. Charles looked stricken. Anne felt a grim satisfaction that William had gone there, had laid out the parallel that everyone had been dancing around. Camilla finally spoke, her voice shaking slightly. "I am not trying to drive Catherine away. I have never wanted her to leave. I was trying to give her space, to not pressure her when she was vulnerable. You were trying to make her feel unwanted so she would leave of her own accord," William said bluntly. "There is a difference between offering support and offering an exit. You have been offering exits, plural, consistently and insistently, until the message became impossible to miss." Catherine spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but clear. "I need to know if I still have a place here, not as a token, not as someone who is tolerated because of who my husband is, but as a working member of this family with important contributions to make. Because if I do not have that place, if the plan is to manage me into irrelevance, then I need to know that now. My children need stability, my husband needs certainty, and I need to know whether I am building a future here or simply waiting to be shown the door." Anne watched Charles carefully. This was the moment. This was when he had to decide whether his loyalty to his wife or his responsibility to his heir took precedence. She saw the struggle on his face, saw the moment when duty won over personal feelings. "You have that place," Charles said firmly, looking at Catherine. "You are the Princess of Wales. You are the future queen. Your work is vital, your presence is needed, and anyone who has suggested otherwise, with whatever good intentions, has been wrong." He turned to Camilla, and his voice was gentle but unyielding. "I know you meant well. I know you thought you were being kind, but the effect has been anything but kind, and it needs to stop. Catherine needs to be supported, not managed. Her return to duties needs to be facilitated, not delayed, and the people who have been working to sideline her need to understand that they have been acting against the interests of the crown." Camilla looked as though she had been slapped. "You believe I was deliberately trying to harm her. I believe you were trying to protect your own position and your own prominence, and that Catherine became collateral damage in that effort," Charles said quietly. "I do not think you set out to be cruel, but I do think you allowed your insecurities and your people's overprotectiveness to create a situation that was deeply damaging." The aftermath. The meeting ended with no tearful reconciliations, no immediate healing of the rifts that had been exposed, but it ended with clarity, and sometimes clarity was more valuable than comfort. Lines had been drawn, positions had been stated, and most importantly, Catherine now had the explicit support of the king in writing, which Charles had committed to providing in a formal memorandum to senior household staff. In the days that followed, changes began to ripple through the royal machinery. Certain courtiers found themselves quietly reassigned. Patronages that had been transferred away from Catherine during her illness were transferred back. Her private secretary was authorized to expand staff again rather than reduce them. Most significantly, Charles made a point of being photographed with William and Catherine, of praising Catherine's work publicly, of making it clear through both word and action that the Princess of Wales remained a central figure in the royal family. Anne watched these developments with cautious satisfaction. The immediate crisis had been averted, but she was under no illusions that the underlying tensions had been resolved. Camilla felt humiliated and betrayed. Charles was caught between his wife and his son, trying to maintain relationships in both directions while being honest about the failures that had occurred. William was wary, waiting to see if the promises made would be kept or if this was simply a temporary appeasement. And Catherine was quietly rebuilding her confidence and her health. Anne made a point of staying in regular contact, of offering support not through grand gestures, but through steady presence. She attended one of Catherine's patronage events, her presence sending a clear signal about where she stood. She invited Catherine to Gatcombe Park for a private afternoon, where they walked the estate and talked about horses and children, and the particular challenges of being a woman in an institution designed by and for men. "You reminded Charles of his mother," Anne told Catherine during that visit, "when you spoke about needing to know if you had a place here. That is exactly the kind of direct question my mother would have asked. She had no patience for ambiguity about fundamental matters." Catherine smiled slightly. "I was terrified saying it, but I realized that I was more afraid of not knowing than I was of knowing the worst." "That is wisdom," Anne said approvingly. "Uncertainty is more corrosive than even bad news. At least with bad news you can make plans, take action. Uncertainty just paralyzes you." They walked in silence for a while before Anne spoke again. "This is not over, you know. Camilla will never quite forgive you for this, even though you did nothing wrong except refuse to disappear. She will be polite, she will fulfill her duties, but there will always be that edge of resentment. You need to be prepared for that." "I know," Catherine said quietly, "but I also know I cannot let someone else's resentment dictate my choices. I have work to do, important work around early childhood development that could genuinely change lives. I cannot let personal politics stop me from doing that work." Anne felt a surge of respect for the younger woman. This was why the public loved her. This was why she represented the future in a way that Camilla never could. Catherine understood that being royal was not about status or precedence or privilege. It was about service, about using the platform to make a difference in people's lives. That had been Elizabeth's philosophy, and it was clearly Catherine's as well. The relationship between Catherine and Camilla remained cool but functional in the months that followed. They appeared together at family events, maintained a cordial exterior for the cameras, and carefully avoided any private interactions that were not absolutely necessary. Charles continued trying to bridge the divide with limited success. He had learned a hard lesson about the dangers of allowing personal feelings to cloud judgment about institutional necessities. William and Anne grew closer through the crisis. There had always been a bond between them, a shared sense of being the practical ones, the ones who understood duty without needing it constantly explained. Now that bond deepened into a real alliance, they spoke regularly about the future, about how things would need to change when William eventually became king, about lessons learned from both his grandmother's successes and his father's struggles. "When I am king," William told Anne during one of these conversations, "there will be no ambiguity about Catherine's role. She will not simply be a consort, she will be a partner. Her work will be valued equally to mine, and no one, no matter how long they have been part of the family or how close they are to me personally, will be allowed to undermine her." Anne believed him. She saw in William the steeliness that his grandmother had possessed, tempered with a modern understanding of how the monarchy needed to evolve. He had learned from his mother's tragedy, from his father's mistakes, from his grandmother's wisdom. He would be a good king, perhaps a great one, and Catherine would be the queen that the role needed. As for Anne herself, she continued her work with the same dedication that had characterized her entire royal career. She made no public statements about what had transpired. She gave no interviews hinting at palace drama. That was not her way, and it would not have served any useful purpose. But those within the royal family understood what she had done, understood the role she had played in preventing what could have been a catastrophic fracture. At a family gathering at Sandringham that Christmas, Anne found herself standing with Catherine, watching the children play in the fading afternoon light. George was teaching Charlotte and Louis some game that involved a great deal of running and shouting. Their laughter rang out across the grounds, pure and uncomplicated in the way only children's laughter could be. "They are the future," Catherine said softly, echoing Anne's words from months earlier. "Not just because of their titles, but because they represent hope. They are being raised to understand service, but also to understand joy, to balance duty with humanity. You are doing well by them," Anne said. "Better than most of us did by our children, if I am honest. The weight of this life can crush the happiness out of people if you let it. You have not let it, and for that I am grateful." Catherine looked at her with surprise. "Grateful? For the monarchy," Anne clarified. "For what it needs to be going forward. We are dinosaurs, you and I and Charles and all of us who were raised in that old rigid system. But you understand instinctively what it took us decades to learn, if we learned it at all. That connection matters more than mystique. that humanity matters more than hierarchy. You are teaching your children that, and they will be better rulers for it. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. In the distance, Anne could hear the rest of the family gathering for dinner. Soon they would have to go inside, put on their public faces, navigate the complex dynamics that came with being royal. But for this moment, standing in the fading light, watching the children play, there was peace. "Thank you," Catherine said suddenly, "for believing me, for fighting for me. I will never forget what you did." Anne shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "I did what was necessary, what my mother would have done. The crown is bigger than any of us, and protecting it means protecting those who will carry it forward. You are one of those people, Catherine. Do not ever let anyone make you forget that." They walked back to the house together, two women separated by decades and experience, but united by dedication to duty and to family. Behind them, the children's laughter still echoed across the grounds, a reminder that no matter how dark the internal struggles might become, the institution they were all working to preserve still had the power to inspire joy and hope. The battle had been won, but Anne knew the war was not over. It never really was, in a family as old and complex as theirs. There would be other challenges, other conflicts, other moments when personal and institutional interests collided. But they had survived this one. They had faced it honestly, however painful that honesty had been, and they had emerged with a clearer understanding of who they were and what they stood for. As Anne settled in for Christmas dinner, surrounded by family both beloved and merely tolerated, she caught Catherine's eye across the table. A brief nod passed between them, an acknowledgement of shared understanding. They had weathered the storm together. Whatever came next, they would face it knowing that they were not alone, that there were others who understood what was at stake and were willing to fight to protect it. And in the end, perhaps that was what being royal truly meant. Not the titles or the palaces or the ceremonial robes, not the power or the privilege or even the duty. It meant understanding that you were part of something larger than yourself, something that had existed before you and would continue after you were gone. It meant being willing to sacrifice personal comfort for institutional survival. It meant fighting for what was right even when it was difficult, even when it cost you relationships, even when the easier path would be to look away and pretend you saw nothing wrong. Anne had never been good at looking away. Neither, it turned out, was Catherine. And together, with William's support and Charles's reluctant acknowledgement, they had ensured that the future of the monarchy remained secure. Not perfect, never that, but secure, stable, and in the hands of people who understood what it truly meant to serve. The palace gates locked as winter darkness swallowed Windsor, but in the king's private safe lay a burgundy folder that could never be destroyed. Princess Anne's evidence of a queen's betrayal, proof that the crown's deadliest enemy had worn a crown herself. Camilla still smiled for cameras and performed her duties, but her power had been shattered, her schemes exposed, her carefully constructed image revealed as a mask hiding calculated cruelty. And Catherine, the woman Camilla had tried to break and banish, now stood stronger than ever, knowing that when the throne finally became hers, she would remember exactly who had tried to destroy her, and she would ensure that nothing like it could ever happen again.